Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines: bridge closed as Russia reports 11 Ukrainian drones shut down over Crimea. Ukraine claims North Korea is already supplying Russia with ammunition. Plus, Germany delivers Marder armored vehicles to Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. Russian air defenses shut down 11 Ukrainian drones over Crimea this morning. That's according to a statement from the Russian Ministry of Defense. The statement comes as local authorities close the Crimean bridge to traffic. The statement also added that those on the bridge and in the inspection area were asked to remain calm and follow the instructions of transportation security officers. A Russian drone attack early on Wednesday damaged port infrastructure in the Izmail district of southern Ukraine, an important grain exporting hub. Regional Governor Oleg Kipper says the attack on Izmail, which is in the Odessa region, was carried out in several waves. The Ukrainian military later reported that the 4.5-hour attack had caused a fire at a truck parking lot, injuring 6 truck drivers and 1 local resident. The Ukrainian Air Force added that 32 of the 44 Iranian-made Shahed drones that Russia launched into Ukraine overnight had been destroyed. Ukraine is claiming that North Korea is already supplying Russia with ammunition. Representative of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, Andriy Yosov, says with certainty that cooperation continues between North Korea and Russia. He was speaking in an interview with Ukrainian state media and pointed out that such intel between the countries has been intercepted and recorded. According to him, Russian requests are mainly for projectiles for artillery and MLRS. He was referring to rocket launches, although he did not provide any detail or evidence to support the claim. South Korea's government is concerned about military cooperation between North Korea and Russia. Speaking at a news conference with local journalists in Seoul, the Unification Minister in charge of relations with the North, Mr. Kim Yong-ho, said he is worried about arms trade between the two. His remarks came a day after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un met with President Vladimir Putin in Russia's Far East. The two leaders discussed military matters, the war in Ukraine, and possible Russian help for the North Satellite program. The U.S. believes President Putin gave numerous hints that military cooperation was discussed, but disclosed few details. The Kremlin said sensitive discussions between neighbors are a private affair. Following the meeting, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is signaling that Moscow must tread carefully. According to him, any form of cooperation of any country with North Korea must respect the sanctions regime that was imposed by the Security Council. It's unclear just how far President Putin is prepared to go in fulfilling any North Korean wish list for technology. U.S. and South Korean officials have expressed concern that Mr. Kim Jong-un could provide weapons and ammunition to Russia, which has expended vast stocks in more than 18 months of war in Ukraine. This is after a rare summit in which they discussed military matters, the war in Ukraine, and possible Russian help for the secretive communist state satellite program. Moscow and Pyongyang have denied such intentions. White House National Security spokesman John Kirby says the U.S. is watching the situation closely.
Well, we're watching this very, very closely. We'll see what the two sides say as a result of this. As I've said before, we continue to urge North Korea to meet its public commitments not to support Russia's war in Ukraine. No nation on the planet, nobody, should be helping Mr. Putin kill innocent Ukrainians. And if they decide to move forward with some sort of arms deal, well, obviously we'll take the measure of that, and we'll deal with it appropriately. As Jake Sullivan said last week, there will certainly be repercussions for North Korea, both from the United States and from the international community. As for what either side will get out of this, again, I think we have to watch and see what actually comes out of this discussion. We obviously have concerns about any burgeoning defense relationship between North Korea and Russia. Again, it remains to be seen what either side A, wants out of this, and B, will get out of it. These are not two countries that work well with others, and they don't really have all that much trust and confidence in each other. So we'll have to see. But certainly any arrangement that would improve North Korea's military capabilities would be of significant concern to us.
Elements of a possible drone were identified on NATO member Romania's territory following Russian drone attacks on Izmail just across the border in Ukraine. If confirmed, it will be the third time that such fragments have been found on Romanian territory in recent days. A local military commander told the media on the scene that the site is not easily visible from the ground and had been spotted by a helicopter. He said metal and composite fragments had been found but could not give more details. Speaking before the latest discovery was announced, Romanian Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu appealed for calm, saying no one was attacking Romania. Attacks on Ukraine's river ports, just hundreds of meters from the Romanian border, have increased security risks for NATO, whose members have a mutual defense commitment. Germany has provided further support for Ukraine by supplying equipment and weapons, including 60 infantry fighting Marder vehicles with ammunition, reconnaissance and surveillance equipment, munition, other aid in the latest military assistance delivery. In a statement, the government says that these come from suppliers of the federal armed forces and from deliveries from industry financed by the federal government's funds for security capacity building. We have with us security expert Mr. Chidi Nwanu, who speaks to us virtually from London. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It seems with 11 Iranian-made drones or drones of whatever source or origin shot over Crimea, that Crimea has a bull's eye on it. Why the increased, in your view, activity against Crimea?
In my view, there's maybe two clear reasons, the strategic and the operational. So from the strategic point of view, Crimea is the original sin of the Ukrainian conflict. This is the first part of Ukrainian territory that was taken by the Russians. It's symbolic in Ukrainians' mind that is, the loss of Crimea and the lack of international response is what led to the war in Donbass and then led to the February 2022 invasion. So for the Ukrainians, the recovery of all their territory, including Crimea, is key. And you can see a lot of the strategic messaging, including, the new defense minister is a Crimean Tatar, a Muslim Crimean Tatar. This is, again, part of the strategic messaging to say that Crimeans are Ukrainians, are part of Ukraine, and Crimea is Ukrainian territory. So from a strategic point of view, this is a key part of what we would describe as Ukraine's theory or picture of victory. But from an operational point of view, the Ukrainians have finally broken through the first line of Russia's defense and are slowly advancing forward. Now, this is a critical time for the Russians in that they obviously need to put reserves, put a lot of resources to support their forces who are fighting that defensive battle. So a lot of supplies will be passing through that Crimean lines of communications, through other lines of communications. So these strikes on these targets, be it the one that was shot down, this morning, or the successful one yesterday on the dry dock, they all put pressure on Russian resources. And again, closing the Kerch Bridge, that's more pressure on Russian resources. It means whatever supplies that were going to come off of the Kerch Bridge today either need to be rerouted, or that means they're going to go without, or they're depleting their resources. So they're putting pressure on the Russians as they're fighting this, defensive battle in the vicinity of Tokmak or Robertino. So that's maybe the operational objective. But as I said, it's a combined effort, and it seems to be, at least this week, succeeding for the Ukrainians.
One understands why it could be a strategic move, as you've opined, but with the counteroffensive at this point, this late in the day, is this make or break season for Ukraine?
Yes and no. So, I mean, yes, in that they are very close to the end of good weather. And the benefit of the good weather is not so much that you can't fight in the mud or you can't fight in the rain or you can't fight in winter. You can. It just puts, again, as I said, it puts more pressure on your resources. It puts more pressure on, you now, with the rain or with the clouds and all of that, your sensors like your UAVs, your search planes, they're not on radars. They're not as effective. There's more clutter, that obscures them. Your infantry on the ground, cold weather is, if you've ever slept outdoors, or had to live out, it's really horrible. And, you need more equipment, more waterproofs, warm kit, warm food, the ability to cook, all of that kind of stuff. Your trucks, your tanks are going to be destroying the roads, the fields. It's much more difficult for them to pass. So you can fight in winter. It's just much more difficult, and in the rainy weather, but it's much more difficult and you're going to go much more slowly. So the Ukrainians have a window where they need to break through this line, defeat the Russians and exploit. So by exploit, I mean, the Russians are broken. They are no longer able to mount an effective resistance and effectively running. And that's when you need this free-flowing kind of warfare where you can move with tanks and vehicles without, not at this slow grinding pace that they're going. So that is the limitation that the Ukrainians are facing in terms of time. They're fighting against the weather. They're fighting against resources, and here, which is manpower, ammunition. But also, they're not necessarily constrained by this, because whether we like it or not, however the messaging is going, there will be another year of this war. 2024 is going to be a critical year in this war. However this Ukrainian offensive ends, whether they do reach the Sea of Azov or not, there will have to be another offensive next year to complete, the liberation of Ukraine, as it were. So for the Ukrainians, they just need to, wherever they end this offensive this year, if they end it at the Sea of Azov, that's great. If they end it halfway there, it's okay. But they know they have another round of fighting next year. And I think a lot of the words that we hear nowadays about F-16s and this and that is all getting everybody slightly ready for that war. And again, the final critical thing about next year and the reason why there is going to be another round of fighting next year is two critical elections. The Russian presidential election and the American presidential election. Both sides, this is a strategic kind of arena for both of them. So for both sides, both of this war will be a key part of both presidential campaigns. So irrespective of whatever happens this year, there will still be fighting going on next year.
In a recent tweet by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the platform X, formerly known as Twitter, he insinuated that the allies should keep up their supply of aid to Ukraine, and that if they didn't do that, it will rub the Ukrainians who are outside the country the wrong way, and he wasn't in control of how they would react, something to that effect, or nature, he said in that tweet. You're in London, and over 25 million border crossings from Ukraine into the various nations surrounding in Europe and in the immediate environment of Ukraine. Do you come across Ukrainians who are refugees in London? And what's the sentiment in the UK at the moment concerning the war?
Well, in direct answer to your question, there are, wherever you go in, where I am here in London, there's Ukrainian refugees. There's Ukrainian refugees, in my kids' schools. There's, you see them everywhere in the parks, supermarkets, and they're just there, living their lives, trying to get on. Some people. Early on in the war, we did a bit of work with them, and just, even when, you go to military camps or anything, you see Ukrainian soldiers training. It's a part of everyday life. Everywhere you go, you'll see Ukrainian flags. If you go to the airports, there's signs in Ukrainian. There is a massive effort to kind of help the Ukrainians, by the people of the UK, but not just in the UK. Anywhere you travel in Europe, you see the same thing. Signs in Ukrainian, flags, help, that's being rendered to them. So, I would say credit to the people of Europe. They've really opened up their arms to their Ukrainian kind of compatriots. The same, particularly the countries bordering, poorer countries or smaller countries like Slovakia have taken a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and, they don't really have as much resources as maybe countries like the UK or Germany. But they've taken them in, housed them, and I remember around that time when the war started, there was a lot of organic stuff going on online, if people like us who monitor all these things, you could see people struggling around to help, again, from a Nigerian point of view, there are many Nigerians stuck in in Ukraine, Nigerian students. And, many of us were running around trying to see how we can get these people out. And, that was help when we were linking into all these other countries, Romania, Slovakia, there was so much resource available. And, there was a lot of controversy then about, Africans not maybe being able to access these resources. But the key thing was that, the key thing in relation to your question is that the Europeans, really opened up their arms to the Ukrainians. And I think in relation to the comment on Twitter, that was taken from an article in The Economist, and it's been kind of cut and paste by, maybe I'll say pro-Russians to take the context out, in which he was actually trying to say that he didn't know how the mass of Ukrainian refugees were going to react if there was a defeat or if there was a lack of support. I don't think, if you read the entire quote, I can't quote it off head, he's not really threatening Europe. He's really just saying that there is a whole population of Ukrainians that will be, affected by a defeat rather than just people in Ukraine.
Well, Kari Lake, governorship aspirant in the United States, has been making a meal of that statement. And you're probably correct that maybe it's blown too much out of context if that's not the message that he intended. But you just mentioned that you have Ukrainians in your kids' school in London. What is your biggest concern about the psychological impact of the war on minors, especially those who are displaced because of this conflict and those who are inside Ukraine during this conflict?
So this is a critical question, in that post this war, there is going to be a huge issue of a massive mental health crisis, in not just in Ukraine, we have to be clear, but also in Russia as well. There is, and especially in Russia, not just against, with Russian soldiers, but, the Russian border regions are now under attack not almost every single day. The Ukrainians are attacking the region, the Belgorod, Kursk, Rostov, Bryansk, and inflicting, quite a bit of damage. There was a huge population of people who are war damaged, who are going to be mentally traumatized. And you've got to imagine the resources that are going to be available to kind of bring these people back into society or help them to live a normal life is going to be huge. I mean, for people who are here in the UK now, I mean, I remember, a friend of mine who, her mother escaped from Mariupol after the siege. And, the lady is still traumatized, but there's several problems that she has. The first is, obviously, old school people don't really, do all of this mental health stuff. So it's very difficult to convince somebody, who's an elderly lady to go for therapy. But more importantly, she doesn't speak English. She speaks only Ukrainian. So if she's going to go for help or therapy, she'd need a Ukrainian speaker or a translator. And more importantly, she is, part of her symptoms is isolating herself from anything relating to Ukraine. So she doesn't even want to speak to fellow Ukrainians. So this is just a microcosm of the kind of problems that, will be facing refugees. And everybody will have different problems. There'll be some people who can communicate in English, but, there'll be cultural issues, where, for example, we as Nigerians, there are different ways we look at problems that will be incomprehensible to a Westerner. It's the same thing with the Ukrainian. A Ukrainian's problems might be incomprehensible to a British person or to an American. And, trying to access these kind of resources, even if they're available, is going to be difficult. And the final point, is they're not necessarily available. The UK is having its own public services crisis in which lots of medical services are overstretched. So even if these resources are available, there's a long waiting list. And if the Ukrainians are now put on ahead of that list, that's where you start seeing maybe tensions will start arising, or people will start questioning why these people are being put ahead on the list. So it's a key question, and a question that, has been put to the Ukrainian authorities many times. And to their credit, they are thinking about it, and there are things that are going on. But it's a problem it's a ticking time bomb that's waiting for Europe and Eastern Europe in particular in future.
Indeed, Mr. Wanu, it's very concerning, because I'm thinking these are the human interest and human angle stories that get lost in the larger picture of the conflict and the supply of weapons and the immediate scenes on the battlefields. The impact on the elderly, vulnerable groups, the impact, you mentioned an elderly person just now, the impact on the physically challenged, the impact on minors, the impact on teenagers who are in a formative stage of their personalities. And this war just blows that out of the water, because they're trying to figure out who they are as teenagers in the midst of this debacle. At this stage of the war, what is your impression of any sort of mediation at this stage that can possibly, during the winter or early next year, bring both parties back to the table of negotiations?
So again, as any good analyst will tell you, or even semi-good analyst will tell you, you never make these kind of predictions. But I'm going to say it is highly unlikely that there will be any negotiations, any meaningful negotiations before November 2024, for the reasons that I alluded to previously. There are two key elections next year, and neither side is at the point where they are defeated. The Ukrainian, as I said before, the Ukrainian theory of victory is the recovery of Crimea. That's when the war ends. And, I was at a presentation last night by, a Ukrainian politician, and she even went further to say that the Ukrainians, beyond looking at just Crimea, it has to end when the Russians, pay reparations for what they've done, when they've sent back all the children that they've abducted, they've paid for the damage and all of that kind of stuff. So the Ukrainians are still in a very maximalist position because they still are confident that they can win. And, as they've demonstrated this week, they are hitting Russia in ways that are incomprehensible. And, I make this point, to people that if you've ever worked on the Russia problem as it is, the fact that anybody could strike Moscow or strike, the Russian Black Sea Fleet is something that was incomprehensible. It's just very difficult to process. It was almost when we couldn't even practice it because it was just something we didn't think about. And the Ukrainians are doing it with impunity, so they still believe they can win. And likewise, the Russians still believe they can win. They've got more men, they've got a bigger arms industry, they've got more resources. And as far as they're concerned, if they can wait out, Western support, if they can get to November 2024, maybe a Republican or maybe Trump wins, then that ends American support. And they've only now got to deal with European support for Ukraine, which they hope will fall off. So they still have a theory of victory, which is that Western support dries up, Ukraine runs out of weapons, and then, will surrender. So until the earliest we're going to get any meaningful sort of peace agreement will be after November 2024. So that will be after the winter offensive, or whichever side, after the next summer offensive, and after the elections. So a lot of young men are still going to die and be injured because at this point, the old men haven't figured out that this war needs to end.
Well, for all our sakes, I hope you're wrong about that 2024 prediction, Mr. Nwanu. Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for your insight and contribution this morning, Mr. Chidi Nwanu, who joined us from London today.
Thanks for having me.
After the break, the European Parliament adopts resolution calling Belarusian president an accomplice in Russia's war crimes. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to the Soul for More stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. A leading Russian journalist has had her phone compromised using Israeli spyware. Researchers say this is the latest sign that phone hacking tools are being used to spy on media workers and opposition figures worldwide. A joint investigation by Canadian internet watchdog Citizen Lab and digital rights group Access Now found that the phone of Galina Timchenko had been infected using spyware built by the Israeli company called NSO Group. The infection began on or around February 10, 2023. The researchers did not identify who would have deployed it. Media defense groups condemned the alleged surveillance with the Committee to Protect Journalists, saying journalists and their sources are not free and safe if they are spied on. Timchenko was quoted in a story published by Medusa as an agency as saying the hacking left her feeling like she's been stripped naked in the town square. The European Parliament is calling Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko an accomplice in the war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine in a resolution adopted on Wednesday. It called for the establishment of an international criminal court country office in Ukraine to find legal pathways for seizing assets of Belarusian leadership and related Belarusian entities involved in the Russian war effort in order to support the reconstruction of Ukraine. The European Parliament also called on EU member states to broaden and strengthen the scope of their sanctions against Russia. It suggested applying the same sanctions against Belarus as it currently does against Russia. The parliament also called on Russia and Belarus to be put on the EU's high-risk third country list with regard to combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism. The family of U.S. journalist Evan Gershkovich are appealing to the United Nations for help in their bid to get him free in Russia, where he was detained in March on spying charges that carry up to 20 years in prison. Standing with the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, outside the UN Security Council, Gershkovich's parents and sister say they'd submitted a petition to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention. The working group has a mandate from the Geneva-based UN Human Rights Council to investigate cases of deprivation of liberty imposed arbitrarily or inconsistently with international standards by sending appeals and communications to governments to clarify or bring attention to such cases. Gershkovich was arrested on March 29th in the Ural city of Yekaterinburg. No date has been set for his trial, and late last month, his detention in Moscow's Lefortovo prison was extended by 3 months to November the 30th. He is denied the charges.
As you can imagine, this is a very difficult time for our family. Evan has now been wrongfully detained by Russia for nearly 6 months for doing his job as a journalist. We are still in shock. Every day is a day too long. I miss him every day. Evan loves being a journalist. His passion is reporting the news and helping people understand Russia and the Russian people. He's always been curious about the world and loved traveling. He cares deeply about people. His reporting has kept the world informed, and we all miss reading his stories. Now what he writes is letters. We've been able to send letters back and forth, and it gives me comfort to see how strong he is. We are glad he's kept his sense of humor, teasing me that the prison food reminds him of my cooking. We are all very concerned, especially since it's been so long, and we want him to come home as soon as possible. The lawyers have filed a petition asking the United Nations to declare that Russia's imprisonment of Evan is wrong and unlawful. We hope this will help bring Evan home sooner.
Now let's speak to retired U.S. Army captain and national defense and military strategist, Captain Bish Johnson. Captain Johnson is speaking to us from our Abuja studio. Welcome to the program this morning.
Thank you, and good morning, Olumide.
So the United States saying to North Korea, don't supply weapons or ammunition to Russia. Ukraine as well, we see that they may have already started supplying ammunition to Russia. North Korea to both nations. Okay, is that a likely answer? Will they heed them in any way, shape, fashion, or form?
Absolutely not. These two countries are the two most heavily sanctioned countries, and somehow they've been able to find a way to continue to sustain themselves, even in the midst of all those sanctions. So the West does not have that much leverage over North Korea or Russia as to stop them from having this deal proceed. The much they can do again is to impose additional sanctions on them, which at the end of the day is not going to have an immediate impact. It's not going to stop whatever deal that they have in the process. And understand too, I'm also seeing China somewhere in the middle of this whole thing going on between North Korea and Russia. You know, there was a time that there was that suspicion of China trying to also arm Russia, in which the West came out heavily and said there will be consequences if China does that. And China, knowing China and the way they operate, they're very much interested in continuing doing businesses. You know, the economy is very important to them, so they like to continue doing businesses with all their strategic partners. So what I'm seeing here is a situation where North Korea will supply arms to China, to Russia, and China will in return resupply or restock North Korea. That's what I'm thinking. There's no credible intelligence to that yet, but I'm suspecting that is probably what is going to happen.
What do you think their biggest fear is? Because they're making much ado about this, the United States especially. Is it the ammunition supply to North Korea itself? If they do that, will that make as much of an impact as to sway the outcome or the progress of the war? Or is it fear of the two nuclear powers coming together and having other discussions that they are not privy to?
I think it's all of that. If you go back, you see what has happened with the drones that were supplied by the Iranians. The Russians have been very effective in utilizing those kamikaze type of drones that were supplied by Iranians in causing a lot of havoc in Ukraine. And so with North Korea supplying them with these artillery shells, which they suspected that they have more than 30 million rounds of it, in various places in their country, of course, that will be helping in boosting their war effort. And also, in return, the North Koreans are interested in trying to improve their missile technology. So, and this is something that both the United Nations and U.S. and its allies do not want to see happen, a situation whereby North Korea is able to improve on its, missile technology. And so, yeah, the cooperation of these two nations is to me is a great nightmare or headache to the West.
The state of the counteroffensive has been slow, it's been laborious, it has acceded to by Ukrainians as being painstaking, but however progressive. Russia has a different story to tell. They say that in the southern part of the region, they are making some offensive headway, but the Ukrainians are doing so in the eastern part of the region. How much of a factor does this harsh winter, which they speak of, always have or will come into play to dissuade either parties from going against each other as they've been in the past 3 months?
Okay, just like your previous speaker also alluded, winter season is usually, it's not that there won't be military operations in winter season, but it's usually much more difficult for maneuver units to be able to operate like they would ordinarily operate during the dry season and stuff like that. Winter is going to take more resources, is going to slow movement down, and is going to require more planning for you to be able to actually get to your objective. And so, yes, it does slow operations down on both sides, both the Russians and the Ukrainians. That's why all of them are talking about winter, because it does slow maneuver units, down. You can't usually take your tank through areas that ordinarily you would have taken them through. Your infantry vehicles, sometimes may be stuck in the mud. And plus, even you as a soldier, you have to dress heavily, against cold and all that stuff. So it does require more resources, and it does slow operations down.
Now to the Alexander Lukashenko, president of Belarus story, where he's been targeted for sanctions to be placed alongside President Putin for all the offenses that they can muster, including maybe war crimes. Is this a fair move by the allies of Ukraine to do this? Because if they're going to so charge Lukashenko, will they eventually come around to doing the same to the president of Turkey or the president of China or the president of India for that matter, who've also not been as vocal against Russia as Belarus, but have also been supportive of Russia in various ways outside military support.
Yeah, if I think those cases are completely different. I am even surprised that they are coming to this conclusion by now. To me, it seems that Belarus is even entrenched in this conflict with Russia. All the other countries that you've talked about, are neither here nor there. They are not actually in support of the conflict 100%, and they've not backed up Russia's war effort, just like the Belarusian president has. So I think it's a fair game. I thought that this could have come even before now, because if you look at all his utterances, not just utterances, and the actions that he has taken, his territory is, used by the Russians to carry out some of their operations in this conflict. So them targeting him as a war criminal, in my own judgment and in my opinion, is a fair game, because he has been an active participant in that conflict.
There's no record, however, that any Belarusian soldier has been involved in this conflict. There's no record of any munitions from Belarus going to Russia. The greatest faux pas in this case from the Ukrainian side, that Belarus have committed, is the tactical nuclear weapons that have been stationed in Belarus and their obvious support for Russia. Is this the same thing?
Well, yes, I agree with you that none of those things that you have alluded to had already taken place, but they have provided support, both in terms of intelligence. They've also made their territory available for Russian soldiers, if not Russian soldiers, but the Wagner group that had fought against the Ukrainians. Their territory was made available to them, and they have been training together with the Russians. So by so doing, they are contributing to the war effort of the Russians. So I think it's a fair game that he should also be held accountable for his own actions.
Finally, Captain Johnson, a special honor is reserved to servicemen and ex-servicemen such as you when they are in service and for the time served, because these are vocations that involve putting your life on the line. Is this cause worthy of continuous conflict, in your view, that will guarantee the loyalty of either the Russian soldiers or the Ukrainian soldiers as it continues unabated?
Well, as soldiers, professional soldiers, you really don't have more. You don't have more. You don't have that say in what you do as a soldier. But in the wider society, as the war drags on, war fatigue is going to set in. For what you're saying, as far as giving awards and honors, it does encourage soldiers a lot. Even though whether you receive those awards or honors or not, you still have to do your job. The driving factor for soldiers is usually the act of patriotism, the willingness to fight for your country, to defend your country, by so doing, defending your own family. And that is the greatest factor that drives soldiers. The awards and the honors are good. They're good source of encouragement. But whether or not you have them doesn't really affect, your determination to serve.
Indeed, it's a very special breed. Thank you so much for your contribution and your insight this morning. Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain and national defense and military strategist, who joined us from Abuja.
Thank you very much, Olimide.
When we return, North Korea leader Kim Jong-un checks out President Putin's car at Russia's summit. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. We thank you for your company as we journey down the final stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. More than 2,000 people have left the Kupiansk district as of Wednesday after a mandatory evacuation order for 56 settlements on August the 9th. According to Kharkiv regional authorities, that is. In a message on the Telegram app, the head of the Kharkiv Region Military Administration, Mr. Oleh Sinyehosov, says that 2,339 people have evacuated thus far, including 350 children. He added that another 1,438 evacuated on their own, including 164 children. The situation on the front line in the Kupiansk sector is being described as difficult. Russian President Vladimir Putin invited North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to check out his Russian-made limousine on Wednesday ahead of their summit, ceding the spacious backseat to his guest. Mr. Putin and Mr. Kim stood by the presidential Urus limousine parked in the driveway of the Cosmodrome in the Russian Far East, and the Russian president gestured to the vehicle as Mr. Kim stood seemingly curious. Mr. Putin invited Mr. Kim to climb into the back seat and walked around to slide in next to him, who is believed to be an automobile enthusiast. That is Mr. Kim, having been seen in several luxury cars, including different Mercedes models, a Lexus sports utility vehicle, and a Rolls-Royce Phantom. In 2018, then U.S. President Donald Trump allowed him a peek into the U.S. presidential limousine known as the Beast during a break in their first summit in Singapore, but Mr. Kim did not get to sit in it. And now joining us is Laddie Williams, Channel's television business correspondent, to bring us some perspective to the war in Ukraine vis-a-vis the world of business. Laddie, good morning.
Good morning.
Who wouldn't like to sit in the Beast?
The iconic Beast.
The iconic Beast. And it is a beast.
Yeah.
But if we go by everything they say, all the gadgets that they say that it has.
Yeah.
But our producers use a caption for the ride. They call it a snazzy ride.
Snazzy ride.
Thanks, Mary. And Kenny.
Yeah.
So it's snazzy because, and he did that. It's a strategic thing. Before this, we've been speaking of how Russia wants to be independent of, I guess, importing cars. They want to make their own cars.
They want to make their own
and
cars.
sell their own cars to their own people.
Right.
How does that
and the sanctions are not, helping. At the end of the day, we've seen car production in Russia that's plummeted, to new lows, ever since they invaded Ukraine, because they've not been able to import, most of those components needed for, their manufacturing of their cars. So it's quite interesting seeing that, he's a car enthusiast, and many.
Another thing, a quick aside to that is not to digress, but President Putin takes pleasure in, if he likes you, we understand that he'll give you some ice cream.
Exactly.
He likes ice cream a lot.
Yeah.
He did that to President Erdogan on their last visit. Took him also on some previous visit.
Exactly.
Took him to where he likes.
It's interesting to see you see them as really serious people, but they do have a soft side to them.
That's a soft side.
Yeah, it looks quite soft with ice cream.
It could be a sinister side.
Who knows? Really.
Chicago wheat futures fell today.
Yeah, we're seeing still eyes on the wheat prices at this time because we know. Russia pulling out of that, Black Sea grain deal. Everyone was expecting, wheat prices to rise, but we're still seeing, prices subdued there. It did fall below that $6 level for 3/4 of a bushel. It's down about 0.8% today at $5.92. It's a 33-month low, at this time. Remember in 2022 when, wheat prices, gas prices, oil, everything was up, but now they've all come down to reality, except oil that's going in a different direction at this time. But now we're seeing oversupply. There's signs of oversupply coming from Ukraine, even though, the Black Sea grain deal is still off at this point. Traders are expecting a lot of supply coming from Ukraine. We're seeing cheap Russian wheat also, keeping prices down in the market. So, but there are some traders expecting, there'll be tight supply, going forward in a couple of months as the focus now is going to shift to harvest from the southern parts from countries like Argentina and Australia. Right. So, looking at what's going on there, we're seeing a lot of drought. So traders are expecting tight supply from that. So that might, impact prices going forward. But as it is, we're happy, wheat prices are down at this point. That, helps the whole food inflation story, globally.
280,000 tons of grain have been destroyed by the Russians. That is Ukrainian grain.
Yeah.
How is this impacting the Ukrainian economy?
Yeah, it's hitting them hard at this point. It's a war-torn, economy at this point. We're seeing how much grain they used to supply, like it's crashed so much between September 1st and 13th. It's down to about 783,000 tons, at this point. That's what they're exporting right now from about 1.5 million. So it's a big slash, from what they used to, and definitely that's going to impact their revenue. And, with the whole Black Sea grain deal issue right now, they've had to use rail and road to transport, most of their wheat. And that is, they cannot get the kind of volume they need out with that. And it's really expensive, going by rail or road. So all of that is impacting how much Ukraine, sends out, right now. Definitely, we're hoping that somehow some kind of deal is going to come up, that's going to help, boost Ukraine's exports. But as it is now, their exports are really down.
So really, the best alternative to the Black Sea grain deal is the Black Sea grain deal.
Exactly. Or some kind of deal with a new name, but that just lets, Ukraine get their grains out.
Right. How are the markets looking today?
So most markets in Europe now, we're seeing markets are green. Investors there are looking out for what the ECB is going to do next in its rate setting meeting. We got that US CPI
ECB,
data.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, ECB, the European Central Bank.
Right.
So we got that data yesterday, CPI, and it did come out a little hotter than expected, 3.7%. That's in the US, the August CPI. Expectations was about 3.6%, but they got 3.7%. So that has not really impacted the market negatively. We're seeing, stock futures in the US in the green this morning, showing that there's signs that the US Fed might not go too hard at their next rate-setting meeting, because the inflation number was not that hot. But they're shifting their gaze to the PPI data that's coming out today. That's in the US. So that might show signs of what the US Fed might actually do next. But at the end of the day, 97% believe that there's going to be a hold situation for US rates coming in the next meeting. But at the end of the day, markets are watching a lot of things at this point. Traders are still, in between fear and greed at this point. They don't know if it's time to be bullish or not. But with the way things are looking, all eyes still on, rates and what's going to happen, going forward. But we're seeing markets like Bitcoin there, that's holding up about 25,000. Still did get to about 26,000 yesterday. And back here, we got a green close on the NGX. So markets are not looking bad, but investors are still wary about what's going to happen next with the inflation story and rates.
That being said, we pray for an end to the war. Imagine a Ukrainian and Russian president getting into their own cars.
That would be great to see.
Shaking hands.
And maybe sharing some ice cream.
Sharing some ice cream.
Right.
Thanks, Ladi. Ladi Williams, Channels Television Business Correspondent. And finally, Serhiy, that's his name, a fellow, graduated from a culinary school in central Ukraine and dreams of working in a Michelin-starred restaurant. But for now, with his country locked in war against Russia, he's only too happy to feed the troops, to feed them as an army cook. Considerable thought goes into meal planning. He has lots of mouths to feed. He says we have oregano, basil, green and violet. We also have spices for meat. He says, so I add them to make the food taste better and people will have at least some variety of food. As a father of three, he was exempt from serving in the army, but volunteered, keeping alive a family tradition. His father served in the Soviet army in Afghanistan, and his grandfather fought in World War II. The troops say they're impressed with the kitchen. But nothing kills a healthy appetite like an unhealthy appetite for war. Food for thought as we leave you for today's coverage on Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.